So what about child welfare involvement? Well, you've got a lot of it. We have some data on the basis of self-reports in the full sample, national sample, and Child Protective Service records in Alameda County. And as I said before, the self-reports show that most of those separations are informal, not ever known to Child Protective Services. They have to do with hardship. They sometimes have to do with inability to parent, to either the parent's satisfaction or to her relative's satisfaction, and they can move in. And Child Protective Services may never find out about it. Okay. What about the child welfare records? Well, if there is a child welfare report, a potential abuse and neglect from a mandated reporter or another reporter, 4 things can happen. First, the CPS worker conducts a safety assessment and may decide to close the case without an in-person investigation. That's called evaluated out. Or they can conduct an investigation and they can say it's unfounded, it's inconclusive, we're not sure, or it's substantiated. We really have reason to believe that there is abuse or neglect here. Okay? And so this is information about the results of child welfare reports for families in the shelter. And let's walk through it a little slowly because it's complicated, okay? So you see that red box over entry in the middle, and there's a vertical line there. That's the point at which families entered into the study, okay? So that was the beginning of a shelter episode for them. And then going back to the left, we have 90-day periods. Each bar is a 90-day period, and we go back for about 6.5 years. And going forward on the right, each bar is a 90-day period, and we have about 3 years going forward from the time of shelter entry. Okay, you with me? And the color of the bars shows, what the height of the bars is how many families. The color shows the most serious outcome for that family in that period. So if a family had both a substantiated case and an evaluated out case, we'd call it substantiated in that period. The light colored bars, sort of pale pink there, are evaluated out. So the Child Protective Service worker didn't even think it was necessary to do an in-person evaluation on the basis of that report. The slightly darker pink ones are the ones that were unfounded, so there was an investigation, but the decision was that there was not evidence. The brighter red there are inconclusive, that's a small number, and the darker red, almost black here, are the substantiated cases. Okay, so clear what's up there? So now let's think about it. The most striking thing is that reports go way up after study entry, and that most of those reports are evaluated out or unsubstantiated. Okay, most of them are those light colors, the very pale evaluated out, the pink unsubstantiated. Okay, we also see a little bit of an increase, particularly of evaluated out and not substantiated, before people come into shelter. So there's a more modest increase there. So why do you think we have this huge spike afterwards? Why, when families come into shelter, do people start reporting them for child abuse and neglect? Thoughts? They're mandated reporters, okay. Most of the reports aren't coming from folks who work for the homeless service system, but and the mandated reporters have to see something, right? They don't just report somebody because. Yeah.
Neighbors and family, neighbors and friends that are worried about the family because they've lost their housing and call the child protective.
Okay. Yeah.
They see it as a way to connect the family.
Well, that's interesting. Now, these are all families who are in shelters at the point, or have been. I mean, in the first 90 days, they certainly have a period in shelter, and afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So the trauma of being homeless says that, you know, that the stress of being homeless may affect your parenting, and there may be behavior that really is problematic there. And some of the other explanations go more to the visibility of families, so that we see them. They're mandated reporters. We see them when we might not have seen them otherwise. And the fact that so many of these cases are evaluated out or unsubstantiated suggests to me that a lot of it is that visibility. But that's some of the stuff that you'll want to talk about more this afternoon. Why do you think the reports go up before people come into shelter? Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much the way I think about it too. Though, are there other ideas? I'll elaborate on that one in a minute. Yeah.
Sometimes people view a family becoming homeless as something neglectful that the parents are doing, or somewhere the parents are failing by not being able to maintain housing or get housing. They view the parents in a negative way that also allows them to view their parents as negative, not being the parents.
Yeah, and in California, as elsewhere, being homeless is not evidence of abuse or neglect, but that doesn't mean the world doesn't see it that way. Yeah. So going back to the notion that there are a lot of stressors that families are going through before they come to shelter. Going to shelter is not the first thing you do. None of us would, because a new shelter opened up down the block, go and avail ourselves of those services. People try very hard to stay out of shelter, and they're doing all kinds of things to try to avoid that. But they may be moving around a lot. They may be experiencing a lot of hardship. The kids may be falling asleep in school, or they may be hungry. And so we may be seeing the tremors before the earthquake, right? And so that might be a period for prevention and early intervention. That is, at the point when that call comes in, if, as Nan talked about, there were two questions like the VA is asking of every family that's evaluated for a protective service involvement, and if it looked like there was a housing situation that was contributing to whatever the issues are, even if it's evaluated out, even if it's not an issue, or especially if it's evaluated out, if it looks like housing is a piece of that, could that then coordinate with the homeless assistance system? Could that be a way of thinking about prevention? Yeah. So here's the data again leading up to the first shelter entry. The study shelter entry. No, take it back again. First shelter entry. So in these HMIS measures, we have all the entries over a long period of time, and so we can look at the first shelter entry that we have for a family, and that's what these data are from. Later we'll just talk about the shelter entry associated with the study. So this is the first shelter entry, and this is only the pre-part, but what's different from the last graph is that we only show the episode that's closest to shelter entry, the one that came closest to the time families came into shelter. And again, we see that upswing in reports prior to shelter entry. And here's the after data, again, giving only the episode that is closest to the time of shelter entry, but this time afterwards. And again, we see that huge spike of unfounded and unsubstantiated cases after folks come into shelter. Okay. Let's go on to the percentage of families with any report to child welfare at any time over the period that we've got data with any investigation, so the investigations are a subset of any report, with any substantiated report, again a subset, with any foster care placement. That's not necessarily a subset. You could have a foster care placement, for example, if a family caregiver was incapacitated or went into prison without ever having a report of child abuse and neglect. You might have foster care take custody of a child. And we see that the likelihood of all of these child protective outcomes goes up with the number of shelter episodes that families experience. So the more shelter episodes, the higher risk of the family getting involved with child protective services. Okay. So now let's look at predictors of child welfare outcomes after study entry. So now we're focusing on the families at the point that they entered the study and what happened to them afterwards. Okay? And first let's look at just reports of abuse and neglect. And what we see is that a key predictor of being reported after shelter entry was having been reported prior to shelter entry, okay? Past behavior, future behavior, that's not very surprising. The association of CalWORKs with reports may be a chicken and the egg issue. That is, Child Protective Services works hard to hook people up with CalWORKs. And so, and we don't have, our data aren't good enough to allow us to say which one came first, just whether they're after shelter entry or if they're in a particular year. Prior shelter episode, okay? We've seen lots of evidence now that shelter episodes are associated with child welfare reports. Lack of work prior to shelter entry, again, not surprising. It's associated with repeat homelessness. It's associated with more child welfare reports. The most disturbing finding here is that non-white race matters. So, and that's predominantly African American, not entirely. We don't have large enough groups of everybody else to really pull people apart very well in Alameda. So it's true that non-white families have less income and less wealth on average than white families, so that they end up in shelter more often. But all of our families experienced homelessness. So among the families who've been in shelter, the non-white families were more likely to be reported to child welfare agencies. And that was particularly true for families that had never had a prior report. So we had 135 non-white families that had never had a prior report. 40 of them got reported after shelter entry. We had 19 white families that had never had a prior report. 0 of them got reported after shelter entry. And as we've seen, most of those reports were evaluated out or unsubstantiated. So when we look for substantiated abuse and neglect, we don't have any predictors. So race is not predicting to substantiation of reports, it's predicting, it's predicting to the reports, okay? So any bias in the system isn't the child welfare worker who's doing the substantiation, right? They're not showing any differences by race. It's having to do with the reports prior to that time. And some of those reports are coming from the shelter system, most of them are not. We do from qualitative data, we did a qualitative study of 80 families across 4 sites, a quarter of them were in Alameda County, more than a quarter of the families that in the qualitative study, so at least some from Alameda County, said that shelter staff threatened them with Child Protective Service reports to try to induce various sorts of behavior. And I'm sure that the shelter staff and to some extent transitional housing staff are trying to get parents to parent appropriately, but the parents are feeling like the service system is threatening them with involvement in child protective services. So something to consider. And then for foster care placement, again, no issue of race. And the only predictor we have there is foster care placement prior to study entry. Okay, so these are all controlling for the intervention you're in because we know that the subsidy intervention reduces the foster care placements. Okay, So those are the findings. What have we learned out of this? What have we learned first about the intersections among the systems in Alameda County? Well, there's substantial overlap between child welfare and homeless service systems. The child welfare reports, and that's true everywhere. Non-white families are at special risk for reports, but not for substantiated reports, so the bias doesn't seem to be in the child welfare system. It's not as clear where differential reporting originates. And I've said that there are issues with families feeling threatened by shelter providers. Avoiding shelter stays would make families less vulnerable to unnecessary reports. So among the traumas that families go through with reports, I'm not sure they're traumatized if they're evaluated out, but they're certainly traumatized if there's an investigation, because there's nothing really scarier to a family than the possibility of losing access to one of their children. So that's yet another reason to end homelessness, if we didn't have ones beforehand, would be to try to avoid unnecessary reports. Okay. More lessons about service systems in Alameda County. We have this more modest increase in non-substantiated child welfare reports before families enter shelter. Might this be an early warning system for homelessness? Could the child welfare workers regularly investigate families' homeless circumstances or housing circumstances in the same way that the VA has taken it upon itself to say, any report, let's look at housing. Many families are not fully using their benefits prior to coming into shelter. Might hooking families up with benefits, more families, be helpful in averting some homelessness? Okay. Thinking not only about Alameda County, but kind of across the board, the homeless service system's gotten better at serving full families, but it's not good enough. So we still had, across the board and in Alameda County, just over 10% of families with a spouse or partner living elsewhere when they were first in shelter. And based on the qualitative data, which is a small sample, more than half of those had to do with shelter rules, the shelter ability to accommodate full families. And we did not have a lot of kids who were separated from their parents because of shelter rules. We've gotten really much better at teenage boys and the like, but we're still not terribly good about spouses, about three-generational families, about adult children. Some shelters manage to do that, others do not. Programs screen out a lot of families, and surprisingly, the programs that are part of the homeless service system screen out more families than the housing subsidies do, than the housing authorities do. So the programs that are supposed to serve homeless people, and this was certainly true in Alameda County, and it was especially true actually of rapid rehousing in Alameda County, are less willing to serve the families who are homeless, or the families are less willing to go to them, and we can't always tell the difference there. Families, even pretty desperate families who've been in shelter for a week, will turn down programs that they don't think are going to be helpful to them. So that means that if you're trying to do coordinated entry, you need to have a plan B for families. I mean, it may be because of a capacity issue, or it may be because of program requirements. Programs certainly reasonably try to find the families they think they can help, but a lot of families, if a lot of families can't fit into some part of your system, they've got to fit in somewhere else, or they're just not going to get served. Okay, the remaining findings come really from the national study, but they're likely to apply here. So with usual care, no special offer, but lots of services, $30,000 worth of services that people were using over the course of 20 months. Families spent, on average, about 4 months in emergency shelter following random assignment, as emergency shelter has very high levels of services, case management ratios are usually higher than in transitional housing. Despite those high costs, many were not faring well. Some families were doing great, Many of them had disappeared from the homeless service system, not all of them, but a lot of them were doubled up and a lot of them were suffering in some other ways. Transitional housing screened out the largest proportion of families, and the take-up was the lowest of the other interventions. So it may well be a useful intervention for some families, but again, you need a plan B because an awful lot of families get left out. Priority offers reduced homelessness compared to usual care over 20 months, not over 30 months in the Alameda data. Benefits did not extend to other outcomes. So what's going on in the shelters works about the same. And surprisingly, they weren't more effective for families with high psychosocial needs. The goal of transitional housing is to address family barriers that make housing stability difficult by providing social services, and we don't see a lot of evidence that that was achieved. And transitional housing is the most costly of the interventions. Rapid rehousing, altogether only about 60% of the families who were offered rapid rehousing ended up using it, partly because of the programs, partly because of the families. And so take-up was surprisingly low, we thought. Families were given referrals to specific programs that had reserved spaces for them, but nonetheless, 2/5 did not find their way in. Folks who were offered rapid rehousing left shelter about half a month faster than families not offered anything special. That was true also for folks offered transitional housing or housing subsidies. Folks who actually got into rapid rehousing did leave more rapidly, and folks who got into transitional housing left pretty rapidly because there was a space right there for them. Priority access to rapid rehousing had scattered effects on some other outcomes, most notably, and this is important, increasing incomes and food security and reducing school absences. And it may well be that that increased income over the longer term will turn into greater increases in income and will help families really get to self-sufficiency. So a big selling point for rapid rehousing is costs. So overall, it had somewhat better outcomes than usual care at about 10% lower cost for the folks who were offered it, at substantially lower cost for the folks who actually used it. And that allows you to spread your resources more broadly. Subsidies, some of the ideas here were not so surprising. You give people housing subsidies, they stop being homeless. And we see the reductions in your HMIS records, and the reductions in your records go beyond the records in the study. More problematically, the reduced labor market engagement is an issue. It's certainly an issue for policy providers. In some other studies have also found that reduced engagement dissipates over 5 years. I'm not sure people are willing to wait that long. Then there were some much more surprising findings out of the study, we thought. First, that most families who were eligible for housing subsidies, and 84% of those who were offered them used them in a variety of housing markets. And in one of the tightest housing markets in the study, we got even more than 90% using them. So it's I'm not sure what help people were getting in finding units, but they managed. Costs over 20 months were comparable to usual care. Now, those costs may go up in the future as the housing subsidies continue if the usual care families stabilize without using housing and service interventions. The benefits radiated beyond housing stability. There were fewer children separated from families, fewer placed in foster care. Problems like substance abuse and domestic violence that can sometimes lead to homelessness were reduced by housing subsidies. Children had fewer school moves, and the families were more food secure. Those last were true for the temporary subsidies of rapid rehousing as well. But we don't have housing subsidies for everybody. Well, one thing we could do is to try to target those subsidies more deeply. And your housing authorities were really helpful in doing this study, and maybe they'd be willing to do more more targeting here. Or more broadly, I think the study points to the importance of housing affordability. And there are lots of levers that you can use for housing affordability. It's not just housing subsidies, whether temporary or long-term. And Nan mentioned that income inequality is more on the agenda. You know, raising the minimum wage would reduce the difference between what families can afford and what the housing market costs them, helping families with employment programs, helping families with child care. Remember, most of those families have very young children, and child care is equivalent to income and permits work effort. So there are lots of things that you can do to try to raise incomes. There are lots of things you can do to try to make housing more affordable to families, inclusionary zoning, local trust funds, as well as the national one. 300 million works out to a little less than $1 per person in the country, so it sounds like a big number, but it's not. And I think it's got to be all of the above. We need to think about all of these strategies to try to make housing more affordable at the same time, and that involves a lot of people that aren't in this room as well as the people that are, at the same time that we're trying to make the homeless service system and the child welfare system more efficient and more collaborative. So, thank you.